Welcome to Washington in Focus Daily. It's April 21st, and I'm your host, Tim Clauser. New questions are emerging around Washington's push for an income tax as internal communications reveal how far some lawmakers were willing to go to make it happen. Tonight, we're breaking down two major developments. First, the newly signed income tax targeting high earners, and second, the legal battle that could determine whether income taxes expand even further in the state. Newly obtained documents reveal communications between lawmakers and the state attorney general's office about challenging long-standing legal precedent, specifically a nearly century-old ruling that defines income as property under Washington's Constitution. That matters because if that precedent is overturned, it could open the door to a broader income tax beyond just top earners. We spoke with the Center Square's TJ Martinell and Citizen Action Defense Fund attorney Jackson Maynard about what these documents could mean for the future of income tax policy in Washington. First, here's the Center Square's Carlene Johnson speaking with TJ Martinell about what he uncovered through a records request involving the Washington State Attorney General's office.
TJ, one of the main questions I know during the legislative session from reporters, not just from the Center Square, but other reporters was, you're passing an unconstitutional income tax. What of that? Do you feel okay about doing that? You raise your right hand when you take your oath of office to uphold the Constitution. Can you speak to anything you saw in those documents you obtained about whether, in fact, crafters of the legislation were at all concerned about constitutionality?
I don't think that there was any question about the constitutionality among the lawmakers or AGO staff, because they also provided legal memos that kind of outlined the arguments that they're going to make in front of the state Supreme Court. And in their opinion, they think that Colton and the subsequent, they basically think that the state Supreme Court has been wrong for a century on whether or not income's property. I think the one thing that kind of struck me is there was an email sent. So Senator Peterson, who was a sponsor of the millionaire's tax, sent a draft copy of it to Solicitor General Noah Purcell, interested in his thoughts on it, insofar as its objective is overturning Colton. And Noah Purcell sent a lengthy email giving his thoughts, and it ended with him noting that there was no emergency clause in the bill. And he was, he didn't outright advise it. He just noted, if you pass it and there's no emergency clause, then potentially you can have a referendum where the voters can overturn it during that November election. He does say he thinks that anything dealing with revenue should have a referendum, but he was noting that the state's Secretary of State's office will not do that without an emergency clause. It needs to have one.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so let's just be clear there. Noah Purcell is giving guidance to Senator Peterson, the sponsor of the bill, basically saying, I'm not suggesting you attach an emergency clause here, but if you did it, it would make it, the Secretary of State probably isn't going to allow referendum to go forward. So hint, hint, wink, nod, whatever, you might want to attach this. Is that what your sense is of what you received?
I think the thing is that they're, as attorneys, they're there to, advise their clients. And we have to keep in mind that Senator Peterson and the legislature is a client of the Attorney General's office. So they're providing legal advice on this matter. And so I just found it interesting that was something that was noted, and it really, it does raise the question of how many other bills that have been passed with emergency clauses that prevent a referendum were added at the suggestion of the Attorney General's office.
And I wonder how many times crafters of bills go to the AG and say, hey, this is what we're going to try to do. Could you give us some advice here? Is that common practice?
I think the thing that's interesting, they did send or did request legal memos to say, hey, what's the legality of a proposed millionaire's tax, and will it stand up to legal scrutiny? But what's interesting in this regard is a lawmaker is asking his attorneys, the Attorney General's office, to help him craft a bill that will overturn a court decisions, which is different from saying, hey, I want to craft this bill, but I want to make sure it's going to, stand up to legal scrutiny. And their basis is effectively this idea that the state Supreme Court will overturn Colton, not whether or not they're not challenging the fact that it doesn't violate Colton. Their argument is that the Colton decision was wrong, and that the other decisions that agreed with it are wrong. And they make their case in these emails and legal memos that I've obtained. And so that's the frame of the discussion. It's not whether this millionaire's tax is legal under state Supreme Court precedent. They're admitting that it's not. What they're hoping is that this will trigger a lawsuit, which it has, that will force the state Supreme Court to address the question. And so they said, don't call it an excise tax. That's going to just cause confusion. They did that with the capital gains tax, where the state Supreme Court was able to avoid dealing with addressing Colton because they just said it's an excise tax, so the Colton decision doesn't apply. So that's where it was specifically crafted so that it couldn't be overturned under any other circumstances. That was the hope.
What's going to be fascinating is to find out what the response is going to be in the next 24, 48 hours, because if you will, characterize, I mean, you've done a gazillion public records requests as an investigative reporter. You get documents back all the time. How would you characterize this batch of documents that you received, maybe versus what you expected to get, compared to some other big cases you've worked on?
I didn't expect to receive the amount of records that I got. And I think what we're seeing here, I think the bigger, broader context is that voters have rejected a progressive income tax in our state, because something to keep in mind is a flat rate income tax is legal. A progressive income tax is not if Colton decision is upheld. And so voters have rejected this numerous times. And here you have state lawmakers wanting and working with the Attorney General's office to figure out how to get around the fact that voters have rejected it. If they thought voters would support it, then why not do some sort of initiative or constitutional stuff? Because that's the problem, is they'd have to go through a constitutional amendment to get around this issue. And so this is allowing them, because what will happen is if Colton is overturned, they can pass a progressive income tax at any rate to everyone and anyone by a simple majority vote of the legislature.
So I can't wait to hear what reaction's going to be in the next couple of days to all of this, TJ, and for folks, whether they're supporters or opponents of the income tax, how this is going to play into all that, and the legal case moving forward. Right, we've got the Citizen Action Defense Fund suit, and former AG Rob McKenna and former State Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge kind of leading that, championing that. I can imagine that this is going to be playing into the arguments going forward. So good work on you, getting it all. I appreciate you coming on today for this episode of Washington in Focus.
As the legal fight moves forward, the outcome could shape not just this tax, but the future of income taxation in Washington. Now we turn to TJ Martinell's interview with CADF's Jackson Maynard, discussing what these documents reveal about behind-the-scenes conversations and how they could impact the ongoing legal challenge to the new income tax legislation.
Jackson Maynard, thanks for taking the time to chat about my story, which is available on the centersquare.com/Washington news site. So what we found is, or what I received was 988 pages of documents and emails of communication between the Attorney General's office and state legislators, specifically Senator Jamie Peterson from Seattle, and it was discussing the millionaire's tax. And what was so unique about these communications is that they explicitly say that the purpose of the tax wasn't to collect revenue to fund certain programs, but to get a 1933 state Supreme Court decision named Colton overturned, which would allow for a progressive income tax. So, everything's on the website now. The emails are there for people to read and download. So what was your reaction when you read those emails?
Yeah, I think it confirms what was the worst kept secret in Olympia, which is that this entire piece of legislation was specifically designed to force a reversal of 100 years of case law. And I think it's a little bit of a situation where, like the line from Casablanca, we now know that there's gambling going on in the casino. And so, it's a peek behind the curtain at that process. Obviously legislators have a right to introduce bills, and if they disagree with constitutional rulings of the court, part of their job, I think, sometimes is to test those boundaries. I think what is a little bit odd here is um, that you have the attorney general, helping them in that process. And I know that attorneys within the AG's office represent agencies, and they should. It really raises the question of what is the appropriate role of the attorney general in constitutional cases and advising on constitutional legislation, and do they have the right and the duty to advise other constitutional officials that no, you can't do what you're going to do because it would violate the Constitution. And I think there is some discretion there, and you don't have to look any further than 2016 when then Attorney General Bob Ferguson refused to defend state law in response to a tax that the city of Seattle had passed on firearms. And you can agree or disagree on whether or not that's good policy, but the larger issue is the attorney general at the time said, look, I so disagree with the state of the law that I'm not even going to bother to defend it here, and to just sort of go with what the legislative body, in that instance the Seattle city government, I'm not even going to bother to try to challenge their actions there. And so I think the AG's office seems to be exercising discretion in a very political way, instead of doing what they should be doing, which is to defend the law of the state of Washington and defend the Constitution.
Yeah, I think what really struck, because we really almost have to pull back because and see this in theory or on paper, the millionaire's tax is supposed to provide revenue to fund certain programs. That's what a tax should be. But this isn't even trying to change tax policy, and it's not trying to socially engineer anything. This tax was written specifically and very carefully so that it would force the state Supreme Court to take up this issue. And what was interesting is how the Attorney General's office didn't say, like, because an attorney could have said, you know what, I can advise you on what you can do, and here's some stuff, but I don't feel comfortable advising you on how to get legal precedent. And I think that that's the other thing. This isn't some decision that was made 5 years ago. This wasn't a decision that was made 10 years ago or 50 years ago or even 70 years ago. It was made back in 1933. And not to mention the fact that it's not like this was just one decision that's been made over the last century. There's been numerous Supreme Court rulings. One was very, very concise. It just said, if you want a progressive income tax, go to the voters. And they have gone to the voters, and the voters have said no every single time, at least since the 30s. And so that's really just raises this question of, what is actually going on as far as, is this, it seems like it's really walking this fine line of ethical behavior.
Of what behavior? I'm sorry.
It's almost like an attorney who's advising their client how to do something that, according to precedent, is illegal. I mean, that's kind of what isn't that what they're doing? They're basically saying, yeah, this is illegal, and we're going to help you tailor it so it could get declared. It almost reminds me of that line from Phantom Menace, where Palpatine says, "I will make it legal," right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a line too of and I don't know if this comes from Napoleon or someone from that era, but there's the law, and then there's what is done.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that, of the idea that well, I mean, yeah, I think a better analogy is probably Pirates of the Caribbean, that the
More like guidelines and actual rules.
Yeah, the Constitution is just guidelines, right? Like the Pirates Code. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it should be taken seriously, and it should have been incorporated into the advice that they were providing. And so I think that's concerning. I thought it was also a little weird, frankly, that the Attorney General is advising the legislature on how to get around public scrutiny and the opportunity for the public to weigh in. by saying, oh, by the way, you may want to include this clause. Otherwise, the people might have a chance to challenge this with a referendum. And again, it's not really,
Well, also, what is it? Speaking of which, what does that tell you about what he thinks of what the voters are going to say?
well,
I, I mean,
it,
because if they think that the voters support this, well, okay, great, let's run a referendum. Let's let the people demonstrate that they support this tax.
well, I think the fact that the voters have rejected it so many times is why he gave that specific advice of, hey, if you don't want to have them potentially shoot this down once again, here's a drafting suggestion you could have to prevent that. So yeah, that was odd. And then it was very, I think, illuminating to the whole discussion over the marriage tax and how and the marriage penalty, and how the courts have looked at whether or not state actions are impacting marriage and penalizing that in a way that violates the fundamental right of people to marry. And while they did not think that the way that this was structured would infringe on that, I think that's another, another concern here. I mean, the impact of the tax is that individuals would not be subject to it, but the fact that they're married, if they have a certain income level over what's in the statute, could penalize them very heavily. I think is another interesting legal argument on this that clearly they were aware of and ignored.
I think what's going to be really interesting is how, now that this is out in the open, it's really going to change the debate around the millionaires tax, because the proponents are not going to be able to say, oh, well, we're just making the wealthy pay their fair share. That's gone forever, because this isn't a bunch of random people speculating who are just these small level bureaucrats. This is the Solicitor General. This is senior counsel for the Attorney General's office. This is the prime sponsor of the bill saying, I want this written so it'll overturn Colleton and force the state Supreme Court to take up this issue. And so critics of this can just point out, this entire bill's purpose is so that everyone is subject to an income tax at any rate by a simple majority of the legislature.
Yeah, the peek behind the curtain shows that this isn't about just making the rich pay their fair share and going after millionaires. They want to go after everybody in the state and expand it. And the AG's office is essentially giving them a how-to manual in how to accomplish that and expand this thing through some favorable court decisions to every single person in the state. And that should be really disturbing and troubling, especially since they argued so much that that's not what this is about, that there's no plans whatsoever to expand it. And we see since at least August of 2025, that's exactly what they were trying to tee up.
I think what's also interesting is because there was the Quinn decision a couple of years ago and then the state Supreme Court upheld an income tax on capital gains, which they called an excise tax. But it really makes you wonder, what did the Attorney General's office advise that bill's prime sponsor when they were working on that? It raises so many questions. And like you were saying, this was a peek behind a curtain. This was a peek, to pardon the expression, but it was a peek behind an iron curtain we weren't supposed to look past. It was kind of like, the curtain in The Wizard of Oz or something like that, where you weren't supposed to see them having these discussions, because the people in these emails were talking with the assumption that the public would never see this. They would never know that this is going on.
Yeah, and again, the AG's office certainly does provide legal advice to legislators, and they have a lot of attorneys that do that, and the legislature has their own attorneys that help with that process. So I like your Wizard of Oz analogy. I mean, you're definitely kind of seeing the process used to get this thing up, and we get a peek at some of the arguments that they're going to raise and sort of the motivation. I do think it will be ultimately helpful in our litigation on the income tax suit to have this kind of insight into the intent behind the legislature in in drafting some of these clauses.
Right. I think the other thing that's interesting is, let's say this income tax gets the Supreme Court just says, you know what, we're not overturning a century's worth of Supreme Court decisions, and you didn't, the Attorney General's office, you didn't make the case that we needed. It gets overturned, but great. People are already leaving the state over this. I mean, this was let's put aside the amount of time spent preparing the legal memos, the communications, the use of public resources to craft a bill intended to overturn, Supreme Court decisions. But even if it doesn't stay on the books, people are still leaving. And so what is that economic cost of that? I mean, that's another interesting, there's just a lot of different things that this implications and I'd say consequences, ramifications of this tax, that they're for the sole purpose of getting a Supreme Court decision that's been upheld unanimously throughout its history overturned.
Yeah, they seem to be so focused on, can we do this, or how can we get the court to overturn this decision to allow us to do it. You don't see a whole lot of discussion in those emails about, should we do it? Is this really a good policy? Is this going to be best for the state? And you're already seeing people vote with their feet and leaving the state. You're seeing a tremendous pushback in terms of, support for the litigation and support for other efforts by other groups to, challenge this by a referendum or initiative. And so I think the lack of real discussion of the policy implications of, is this a good idea? Are also interesting. They're wargaming. You brought up the capital gains tax. The discussion there about how, I don't think you want to label it an excise tax like we did last time. We were able to sell it then, but you don't want to do it now if your goal is to really challenge this. We should just call it, what it is. And so there's some gamesmanship there that I think is a little odd. And then they even suggest, other legislation like a payroll tax that they think is more defensible. So,
Yeah.
look, I get that attorneys are supposed to help their clients meet their goals. But again, I do believe that the attorney general should have a higher duty, and the folks that work for him should have a higher duty to the law and to the Constitution. And should keep the good of the people in mind when they're making these decisions and when they're providing that advice. And it does not appear, it appears that they were narrowly focused on the questions that state senator wanted to ask instead of sort of the larger issues at play here.
We'll continue to follow this developing story. For now, that's been Washington in Focus Daily. Thanks for joining. I'm your host, Tim Klauser.